Welcome to Rural Health Pulse. I'm Jim Kinnear, Chief Human Resources Officer at the Indiana Regional Medical Center. In this series, we focus on ideas and stories impacting the health of our region and explore the programs and initiatives designed to improve healthcare and wellness. This podcast is a collaborative effort of IRMC and Indiana University of Pennsylvania. In this episode, we are once again speaking with Nick Jacobs. As you may recall, Nick is the former president and CEO of the Windber Medical Center and also the founder and CEO of the Windber Research Institute. Currently, Nick provides consulting, coaching, and project management services through Senior Management Resources. Our topic today is work in the field of genomics and learning how a small rural hospital came to be an integral part of research in this area. Tell me a little bit about, your interest and maybe start with just explaining a little bit about what genomics is to everyone listening.
Let me start by telling you that I got a D once in chemistry in 6 weeks in high school. That was never my forte. I mean, I loved to write. I loved to play my trumpet. I was a musician. I was not a scientist. And so I didn't know what my aptitude might have been in that area if I had focused on it. Most of my science teachers were football coaches, so they weren't real dedicated to it either. But I fell into it very innocently from the perspective of, in 1992, I was an officer, senior leadership at the old then Mercy Hospital in Johnstown, and it was being sold at the time. And I got an interview to be a CEO of a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. And I can tell you that from the day I got the invitation to go there until the plane landed, my wife said, "I'm not moving to Omaha." So it was kind of a done deal that I wasn't going to be able to take the job even if I got it. But the job was at Boys Town National Research Hospital. And when I drove up to the hospital, it looked pretty much like the hospital where I was the CEO, except I noticed that everybody had the club on their steering wheels. Remember that thing to keep people from stealing your cars? So it was a pediatric hospital. It was a children's hospital. And I went in for the interview, and the president of Boys Town was a priest by the name of Father Val Peters. Interesting, colorful guy, PhD. And he took me on the tour of the place, and they were basically, it's like I said, it was basically a children's hospital. And he said, there's something else I want to show you. This is 1992. And he took me to the basement of the hospital, and the entire basement was a laboratory. And it was filled with 35 PhDs. And I said, "What are these guys doing and ladies?" And he said, "They're studying genomics. They're here to study genetics and the impact of childhood deafness and blindness from genetics." 1992. That seared in my brain. It was like, wow, what is this? I thought he was talking about, the genome was like that thing you put in your garden, the gnomes, And so it stuck with me. And, 5 years later, I became the CEO of the hospital I was talking about earlier. And I did everything I could to take what was at that time absolutely a dying hospital and turn it around. I used integrative medicine. I became a Plane Tree Hospital, which it was a movement that I ended up on that board, and we went international with to take the mystery out of healthcare. And during my second year there, I'd gone through the Ornish program, and I was invited to dinner at a physician's home, which I'm sad to say didn't happen often. I'm not sure why, but it didn't happen often. But I was invited to a physician's home, and I was seated beside our local congressman. I knew he was a U.S. representative. I didn't know what he did. I had no interest in politics at the time. I wasn't tracking his career. I had known of him since the Johnstown flood, and it was Jack Murtha. And I was on the vegetarian diet, and it was an Indian dinner, and the doctor's wife didn't know what to give me for dinner because it was a no-fat added diet, and everything was heavily cooked in olive oil and oils. So she brought me this big white plate with 2 egg whites on it. And the congressman turned to me. I'm not going to tell you exactly what he said, but it was like, "What the heck's wrong with you? Why are you doing this?" And I explained to him that I had gone through a program that basically was wellness, exercise, diet, all those things, where they were literally reversing heart disease without stents, without surgery, without medicine. And he said, we're spending $1 billion a year in the military on heart disease. If you could find somebody at Walter Reed or Bethesda who would be interested, I might be able to help you. I had no idea what that meant. None. Zero. But my board chairman at the time was a former Navy pilot. And he said, hey, I'll fly you down. I love to get out and fly. So he made arrangements, flew us down to a little airport outside of Bethesda, and we went over to the Naval Hospital because he was a Navy guy. They were very polite and said, we're not interested, see you later. Left, didn't do anything about it. About 2 months later, I was in Washington, D.C. for a meeting for the Hospital Association, AHA, and I decided, I'm just going to go to Walter Reed. Now, I didn't have a military background. I'd been in ROTC here at IUP, but I never was in the military. And I got in a cab and I said, take me to Walter Reed. Never been there, didn't know where it was. This was the old Walter Reed. Pulled up, got out of the cab, no appointment, didn't know anybody, walked in the door, and the first white coat that I saw, I walked up to. And I said, I'm here because my congressman said if there was anybody here that would consider working with me in my small hospital, he might be able to help. And this doctor said, who's your congressman? And I told him, he said, you need to follow me, son. John Murtha was in charge of $700 billion military budget. And they knew who he was. He was like a 5-star general to them. And he was over there at least, 3 or 4 times a month visiting patients. So he took me up, knocked on the door opened, and there was a cardiologist, a female cardiologist sitting at her desk with Dr. Ornish's book on her desk. And I said, I got this congressman that said if you'll work with me and maybe he can help. And so we went together, we wrote a grant, and we created these Ornish centers at my hospital and at her hospital, Walter Reed, and we even shared employees back and forth. And it went beautifully. And so I was invited to go on a mission to Bosnia. And when I came back, I found out that one of my board members had been diagnosed with and had surgery for breast cancer and had chosen my hospital. Now, this particular board member could have gone to MD Anderson or Sloan Kettering or Pittsburgh or anywhere. She was wealthy. And she chose my hospital and had pet therapy and aromatherapy, massage therapy, and had 24-hour visiting and all those things, and was blown away by it. And again, unbeknownst to me, I had gone in, done a debriefing with the congressman, left. She came up the back steps and had a meeting with him right after that and said, Jack, you're putting 150, whatever it was, thousand or million a year into the military for cancer, but you're not doing anything in your own district. And he said, well, Nick did a good job with that heart program. Tell him to write a grant and get it in by Wednesday. I was at home, had been awake for 23 hours. The phone rang. She woke me up. She was in her car wash that she owned. I could hardly hear her. And she said, you need to write a grant for breast cancer and get it in by Wednesday. And so I wrote a grant, and nothing came of it. We didn't get anything. And it was a good grant. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to submit it the next year. So I submitted it the next year. And about 6 months later, there was a knock at my door, and it was my assistant. She said, there's an Army guy out here that wants to see you. And this young lieutenant colonel walked in, and he said, you just got $7.5 million to study breast cancer. What do you want to do with it? And I said, I want to split it with you. I said, no one's ever heard of this hospital. This is not going to be the center for breast cancer for the United States. He said, well, what do you want to do with it? And again, serendipity, just like meeting that white coat doctor down at Walter Reed, I said, I want to be the Genome Center for Breast Cancer for the Department of Defense. And he said, if we're going to do genomics, we should do proteomics too. And I said, doctor, I think we should do both. I don't know what either one really are, so I'll be the administrator and you be the scientist and the doctor. And 23 years later, we're still working together. But that's how that started. And the story goes on.
That's fascinating. So it's good that you know your expertise and your strengths to play off those. So just building on that, I mean, that's great background of how you've gotten involved in this area. Can you share a little bit, maybe what's the next step, how genomics is being used, particularly in breast cancer as an example?
Yeah, so basically what happened was, again, as a musician, I didn't know what to ask the PhDs who were coming in to interview with me. And the doctor said, look, I'll hire the first 3, then it's up to you after that. And so I interviewed each one of them as if I were from another planet. And you can appreciate this as a person in HR. I asked the questions would have really thrown a normal person off. Like I would say, what is it that is wrong with science in America? What doesn't work in your field? What do you find is the most frustrating thing you deal with? And I took copious notes on every one of those questions. And what I found was that, again, equating it to music school, when you went through the music school, you had 2 tracks. You had the ensemble track and the diva track. And all these PhDs were in the diva track. They were all about, they had to be all about themselves. It was about their discoveries, what their individual findings were, what they published. They would get the money. They would buy the equipment. They would hire the people. They would get mad at me and go to the University of North Carolina. And it was like it was all about them, and it surrounded everything they did. I came out of the environment where I could play solos, but I had to work within an ensemble. And so luckily for me, Dr. Craig Shriver, was a trumpet player. And I said, Craig, I want to set this up like a musician. And he said, like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I don't want them to have everything they're doing on their computer. We're getting the money from one source. It's not up to them to get the money. We're getting that money for this research. So I want ensembles. I want genetics, proteomics, histopathology, informatics. These are all words I learned. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not a genius here. It took me a while to master all this. I want them all to work in teams, and I want an MD on each team, because what I found was with the PhDs, the scientific PhDs, I used to jokingly, lovingly refer to some of this piccolo PhDs because they would get a PhD on one piece of equipment. And if everything's, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. And so I wanted to have these ensembles of scientists working on the same projects where they would cross-pollinate each other. And I'd learned that when I was at Carnegie Mellon as a student there. Back in the 70s, they created these pods where they would put mixed discipline professors in the pods with a coffee pot out in the middle. And they were getting these incredibly creative papers coming because people were cross-pollinating and say, well, it's not that way in genomics. It sure is this way in proteomics. And what about, this is the same gene you're looking at in heart disease. This is the same one we're looking at in breast cancer. And so because we became a DoD center, Department of Defense center, one of the things that was clear to me was that these scientists were getting tissue that was junk in, junk out. They would get tissue that the doctor didn't care about. They threw it down on the table where they had eaten lunch the day before. There was no history of the person. And luckily, the doctor I was working with was also the head of the residency program for surgery at Walter Reed. So he was able to teach all of his residents, and he created a 40-page protocol on how to collect the tissue. And it was pristine, and it was perfectly collected. And then we had 500, which went to 800 fields of demographic information on each patient. Now, electronic medical records have pretty much taken care of that for us, but we had nurses taking that information from each patient. And because they were most in the military, there was a lot of this saluting going on. And so we could tell you if they drank wine, how much wine they drank, if they drank coffee, if they smoked cigarettes, how long they smoked, how many kids they had, everything about them in terms of what we needed to do this research. And it created a type of research information that had not existed previously. And we had it longitudinally. As long as they were in the military, we had access to them. So if they were in for 20 years, we could follow them for 20 years. So that led us to discovery after discovery after discovery that came because of the type of tissue and the type of intellectual information that we had, demographic information that we had on each one. And it's grown and grown and grown to where now the Windber Research Institute, which is called the Chan Soon-Shiong Institute for Molecular Medicine, and I can explain that if you need, now has over 550,000 tissue samples for research. And the genetics and the proteomics and the protogenomics and all these different types of scientific applications are being applied to that tissue to make discoveries. So that's one aspect. I retired from that in 2009 and started another research institute. And in that research institute, because at the time people were becoming very paranoid about, if you know what my genes are, you might see that I'm going to get colon cancer when I'm 50 and you might keep me from getting a job. And so I decided that I would specialize in this research institute in something called pharmacogenomics, where we could look at the 300 genes that metabolize your medicine or your food, or the metabolizing genes, and we could definitively tell you what medications would work for you, would not work for you, or would harm you. I'm happy to report 20 years since the genes were mapped, the mapping of the genome, that I think it was 2 years ago, some of the pharmacy schools started introducing pharmacogenomics to their students. But it's like penicillin was discovered in 27, and they didn't start using it till 44 or something like that. It takes 20 years to break down a lot of that, and to get that information in. Science. The beautiful thing about where we were with the military was that we had OC48 dark fiber lines connecting us directly to Walter Reed, so that we could have the oncology meetings, the radiologist oncologists, all the academics, the geneticists, the proteomics people, the pathologists, all together on Zoom calls, talking about individual cases and what might change the outcomes of those cases.
Earlier, when we were talking about integrative health and wellness, we addressed how that can help save healthcare costs.
Big time.
Could you comment on how genomics and personalized medicine will also have some similar implications?
I can combine them for you. How about that?
That'd be great.
So I got this phone call to go to the convention center in Orange County, California in February, all expenses paid, to meet with somebody. And I said, who am I going to meet with? They said, just bring your information. So I went there, and it was the Music Manufacturers Association meeting. It's like, what am I doing here with all this genetic information, right? And the person I met with was the president of Yamaha Music with a translator. And I showed him what we were doing, and his first question through the translator to me was, will my airplane be able to land at your airport? They wanted us to do experiments where we would enroll patients and have a control group and a non-control group, take their blood, do the genetic analysis prior to an exercise where we would put them around a table and artificially irritate them. Like have them do a puzzle and whisper in your ear, the guy beside you is a lot better than you, or you're not getting that done right, or you're doing it wrong. And then the control group would just go sit in the corner, read, do whatever they wanted to do, and the other group would go in and make music. Literally, we had 8, I call them computers disguised as pianos, because you didn't have to be a pianist to play them. They would light up, tell you where to put your finger, and then do blood tests afterwards on both. And we were able to demonstrate that genetically, it's called upregulated, downregulated, that the stress was being reduced by making music, more so than just whatever the other people were doing. And they took that information all over the world and demonstrated how. And so that's when I decided to introduce behavioral medicine, integrative medicine, into a lot of the research we were doing. And so our breast center had all of the things that I told you the hospital had. We had all types of mindfulness and relaxation and music and pet therapy and aromatherapy and all those things going on there as well. When I retired in 2009, first a surgeon took over, and then a PhD nurse took over, and pretty much threw everything out the window. So it's not all there now. But I still believe in it, and I still see it practiced all over the world.
You've accomplished so much in your career, and you're still actively involved. Can you share your next big project or what you're working on now?
Yeah, well, my passion is in two areas. One is that I want to create a sustainability model for a small rural hospital and for small rural hospitals. And one of the things that's going on in that arena is that we have pretty incredibly high expenses. And so I started to look at what were some of the expenses that could be controlled, but that could also benefit them from a different perspective. Now, let me be very clear up front that I'm not talking about sales here. I'm talking about reimbursement for expenses, and that's a big differentiator. But I alluded to the fact that when we first started collecting tissue, what we found is, let's say they removed a lump for a lumpectomy, all they needed was a tiny slice to determine if that was a cancer. And everything else went into a red bag. Well, the red bags 20 years ago, I don't know what they cost now, but it was $35 a pound to dispose of red bag waste. And what they're throwing away is incredibly valuable material for research. And so I found 3 companies who have positioned themselves nationally to make those samples available to researchers throughout the world. And so one of the passionate projects I'm working on right now is to get all of the local regional hospitals that aren't doing this yet to participate in what would become, in essence, like an Amazon distribution center, not Amazon related, just the power of the word, for research, so that instead of having to pay to throw away all of those valuable serum and blood and all of the things that could be studied that would improve health, turning that into a reimbursable item. And so that's one of the big projects I'm working on right now, and it's something that I pretty passionately believe in, because I've seen hospitals that are doing this that are bringing in $500,000, $1 million a year in covering expenses. The other project that I'm volunteering on and I'm really passionate about is trying to get a medical school at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And I can elaborate on that if you want or not, but I believe that of all of the initiatives that could not only transform the university, but could transform the state and be a lifelong help to this region and to the state and to the surrounding states, is to create a medical school that emphasized rural medicine with genetics and integrative medicine part of it. And it's an expensive undertaking, but just by looking at the 14 state schools that aren't Pitt, Penn State, Temple, or, if they just held 2 seats for each school, they could fill those classes with medical students every single year. And Ohio did this very successfully in the 1970s with Northeastern Ohio Medical School. And it's something that, it would be a gift, because as a former CEO of a small rural hospital, recruiting every doctor costs a fortune. I mean, and getting them up and running and building their practice, and then you can't get them because they're trained in an urban area. They want to stay in an urban area. And so, if we can train doctors here, train them in rural medicine, have them understand all of the nuances of that, and get them to practice in our state by helping to pay for that medical school and for their undergraduate or their graduate costs for medical school, it could be a metamorphosis. Because 10 years ago, there were 120 independent hospitals in Pennsylvania, small and rural hospitals. Now there are less than 16, I think. And each one of those hospitals in each one of those areas is an economic driver. It's a major employer. And it's something that if you're having a heart attack in Marsdale, you sure want to be able to go somewhere and get stabilized. So I'm really passionate about that. I wish if I win the lottery, I'm going to pay for it myself. And I am buying tickets, just so you know that.
That's great. I know there's a lot of people that are going to hope that you hit the lottery if you're pledging that money to help make that vision. And I just want to thank you for your time being here today. I think As you've shared your experiences and stories, I mean, I think one of the things that really has just come across to me is, the openness to innovation and your ability to help make some of that change occur at a lot of different levels as common themes. And it was fascinating to hear about some of your work and looking forward to seeing that continued success and hopefully that vision of the medical college coming together as well.
That would be great. Yeah, it would be a great way to go out. Thank you.
Genomics research is shaping the future of medicine. For these advances to benefit everyone more equally and to improve health equity, it is important for rural populations to be actively involved in this field. Rural hospitals can be an integral part of healthcare innovation and advancement. Rural Health Pulse is a collaborative effort of the Indiana Regional Medical Center, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and the Indiana community. It is produced by Chris Korn from IUP's Division of University Advancement and recorded by the IUP Communications Media. I'm Jim Kinnear. Thank you for listening, and be sure to watch for future episodes of Rural Health Pulse.